Okay, here we go. Everybody, smile at the camera, wave. Once wave. No reaction at all. Oh. What's up? What's up? I like that. Yeah, it worked out pretty good. Pretty amazing sound studio I have here. I mean, the production values here are pretty amazing. All right. So ancient Egypt, the Nile, stuff like that. A couple things really quick. I should add that for the Roman Empire, when Rome became an empire, among so we'll go about 30 BCE. That we are closer to that event in our timeline than Augustus, the first Roman Empire, was to the building of the Sphinx. Wait, they built the Sphinx. The Egyptians. Just give you an idea about the breadth of time, which is kind of amazing how long it was. So, a couple things about first off, gotta understand the Nile River. There was deforestation, 8,000 to 6,000 BCE. And so I love this satellite photograph because you can really see why the Nile is so important. You get a good idea, don't you? These green and then nothing but desert. And so you can imagine how this was like a magnet. It attracted people to the Nile River. And the Nile River, at least from here down to about here, the border of what is now Egypt and Sudan, you can navigate it, so move up and down here very quickly. Now, this way, very difficult, obviously. And then that's when they run into the first cataract or waterfalls. And there'll be 4 big ones, and that will limit transportation, but also kind of protect Egypt. Because who's going to attack them? It's really hard to get here. Desert, cataracts, and the delta is a big swamp. You're very lush and rich, full of all kinds of animals, but still hard to attack. So they could, unlike Sumeria, where they're constantly fighting. In Mesopotamia, there's all these empires pop up. And we stopped it after number ones. We'll come back to the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and Persians on probably Thursday. Here, little behind Sumeria, but they had at least more security to develop this, the amazing architecture we saw in the video. So we have the Nile and a couple of different things about it. The flood, and then it floods the same time every year. It's a gradual flood that carries a nice silt because the Green Nile, which starts way down here in Alabama, it picks up all the Green Nile, which starts down in here, picks up all the silt and nutrients when it starts here in the edge of the jungle right here, and carries it up. To lower Egypt. I want to say upper too. I can't help between. Up is north. Which Australia was. But anyways, they get here and it floods all those nutrients. This gradual flood, the same time every year. And so because of that, it would allow for, well, heck, you don't have to really irrigate at least at first. You just kind of throw seeds and stuff will grow. And the soil, therefore, is really black, rich soil. And for example, some of the best agricultural area in the United States is going to be right here. They call it the Black Belt because of the black soil. Same kind of thing, that thick, rich soil. We have elements of this, but just imagine all the soil is like when you go get a bag of mulch and it's all like that. You have that really good soil. Wheat and barley, but I guess there were just seeds of ducks and geese. Just like, well, you ever see one of those things where the Canada geese are migrating on the field? You see like a whole field of them. That was constant. Just constant everywhere. And some of the ducks would be partially domesticated, and all along with these papyrus roots. the papyrus roots, they grow really fast. They take the root, they dry them out, and you could use them to weave baskets. You could use them even for clothing. And of course, you make out of the pulp, and they would make paper. And that's part of the reason we know so much about them, because the papyrus, a lot of it would survive because it was so dry. Same way with the Sumerians. Of course, we had to learn the language. And a couple more things. We learned about this in the leader about farming villages. So we're going to jump right to a couple of the things in. So about 4,000 BC, that's where I'm going to start. 4,000 BC, you got to put stuff down, I'm not put aside, if the video covered it or not. And by about 4,000 BCE, so remember, this is very similar to the time where the very first Sumerian cities are forming. There were two kingdoms, lower, upper. And Menes the first, he was king of Upper Egypt. He was here. Upper Egypt had the great advantage because all they have to do when they attack is float downriver. I should add the winds, the prevalent winds of this part always blew south. And so they could move upriver hard, but they could do it. But that's one of the reasons why you'll see like where Ramses built those massive statues of himself, they would be downriver from where most people live. So they can move the rocks downriver. Makes sense. And then where we at here? Capital Memphis right here. And this would be the first of the Egyptian dynasties, this old kingdom. And the video did a good job. But there would be 3 dynasties, old, middle, and new. Do not think of this as an organized empire. It was relatively limited to just the river. That's part of the reason why they would build forts here, is because it was to defend the river. But since they were relatively protected, they could build this empire. They spent a lot of money, a lot of wealth into the pyramids. I should add, they didn't have horses yet. And if you don't have horses, you don't have the wheel. I mean, they had pottery wheels, but if you don't have animals to pull, you don't have horses. For the most part, even though they had some metallurgy, most of their weapons were still just wooden spears, sticks. And because they were kind of protected, or they could overwhelm potential enemies. It was hard to move north. And so, this is where we first get the first pharaoh, and then from then on, you'll see pharaohs, the old, middle, and new. And when the Greeks took over, the Greeks called themselves pharaohs too. And so, the Ptolemaic dynasty, they were Greek, but they called themselves pharaohs. And a couple of things we need to know. A theocracy is a religious state where the person in charge of the religion is also in charge of the state. A theocratic state. And the king or the pharaoh, and so here is the crown of Upper Egypt, the crown of Lower Egypt, and that became the crown of the pharaoh, where they combined the two. We see it okay? So when you see the ones in the pharaoh, you get this kind of weird back, and we have that. To me, I always think of it as like a 2-point, yeah. A bureaucracy would be created once they started organizing this, and these are government officials. So these are the government officials that collect taxes, administer laws, etc. Like, basically, if you're a government worker, you're a bureaucrat. I am a bureaucrat, in a way, even though I don't necessarily crunch numbers. But those are government workers. So they begin to organize workers. Once you start doing that, just like in Sumerian, they got to be educated, got to be trained, got to read, got to write, got to do numbers. And they're the ones who would administer and organize trade. And they make sure the trade would run through them, and they would collect taxes. And through them, the government would build canals. In fact, the most important person, besides the pharaoh, would be the one who ran the canals and the irrigation system. So, they know the flood's coming. They would organize canals to save certain parts. Canals would run to reservoirs so they could save water. They would create dams along these to create the reservoirs, storehouses for the food. And one more thing about this. Remember I told you how the reservoirs, they will salinate and get a lot of salt? But because of the flooding every year, even though they were putting salty water on soil, the flood would come, put a whole new layer of silt, and save the soil until the next flood. And so it was this constant battle. Now, in the late 1950s, Egypt built a dam. Remember that one that flooded? We saw that in, was that on Friday we saw that, or was that on Thursday? Where they flooded to save those amazing Egyptian, yeah, everything from the Sphinx on. Well, it's right here with the highest one dam. So they built the dam thinking this would be hydroelectric power. It will put Egypt in the modern world, because Egypt had been colonized, was relatively poor. What happened? When you build a dam, what happens to the floods? Dam blocks the normal water. And so the flooding still happening. Egypt suffered. It was a disaster. So the floods quit. Yeah, they controlled it, but now they had to do other ways to save the soil, so it became more salinated, and they dumped a lot of fertilizer on it, which in the long run can affect the soil. It's one of those sad tragedies. So that's time of the Old Kingdom, and this we saw in the video. The pyramids, the first mummification would be there. And then about mummification, they start burying bodies in the desert, or even just bodies they wouldn't bury. They were so dry, the bodies would survive. And so they would look obviously dead, but you could see the body parts. They wouldn't rot away like they would in warmer, or in your warmer, wetter, or not warmer, but wetter climates. But when they put them in a casing or buried them underneath, the bodies would rot. What a great thing to talk about after lunch. So the bodies would rot, and then the worms would come out. Beauty was very important to the ancient Egyptians the whole time. They would use various things in your hair. And speaking of worms, because the worms would come for the bodies too, you get worms and you mush them into a paste, and then you boil the paste with salt water. And that could be used to, if let's say you're trying to get your hair perfect and it doesn't work very well. I have that problem. I just can't get it perfect. But your rival's hair is beautiful. You tell them you're going to fix their hair, and you dump that worm paste on their head, and their hair falls out. See? Isn't that a great hint for all of you? I bet you weren't ready to learn about worm paste. And it's kind of tasty. Who's eating worms? Who's eating food that you've had worms? Okay, moving on. But they did that worm. Oh, how do you avoid that problem about dumping worm paste on you? Hippopotamus lard. You put hippopotamus lard in it. Here. All of you probably have some hippopotamus lard at home. Just rub that in. So back to this. So mummification. And so they began a whole elaborate system of mummification. And we'll come back to that in just a second. Because the pyramids then would become these dark tombs. At first, they built these burial houses. Think more in terms of a four-cornered kind of building where they would put the tomb underneath. Well, the problem was they put the tomb underneath. They also were preparing. In fact, there's a real archaeologists conjecture by archaeologists believe that when they found bodies in the desert, they looked kind of like they're mummified and like they could still kind of be alive. That's where they believe the Egyptian ideas of the afterlife. Oh, at least the body survives. So if the body survives, we could execute servants and put with them, and then put all kinds of materials in with them, like gold, buy jewels, household things for the afterlife. And so when they started putting them in these big homes, or under these buildings, these burial buildings, or eternity houses, they called them, grave robbers would come in almost immediately. So they started putting mounds and in the house. Grave robbers would figure out a way into them. And so then they kind of reversed it and built the mound over the house. it wasn't long before the mound over the house became a pyramid. And thus to protect from grave robbers, even though the grave robbers always got in. And so these elaborate systems of mummification. And when they would mummify, what's a bell ring? Oh, we got a few minutes, so let me do, how do you mummify? Yes. You pull all the muggins out, put them in a jar, and you put the jars right next to the bodies. Well, it depends. Like for example, King Tut, a little bit later on, they'd be right next. And they were like literally right there. In this one, they would have a separate chamber. And so they take the body, all the parts out here. What do they do with the brain? Yeah, they knock a hole right under your nose. It's a thin little bone right here behind your nose. Knock a hole, get a little hook, pull it out. I guess it comes out quite clean. Huh? Give me that. And then salt the inside, pack it with various fine, better smelling things, sew it back up, or put the bones back over, sew it back up, and wrap them up. And so the body would somewhat survive. And at first, they only mummified kings. Actually, at first, in the beginning of the Old Kingdom, they would actually tell kings, "You're too old to rule anymore," and they would hasten it. And then finally, the king decided, "I didn't like that anymore," and so then they would actually do a ritual killing of them. And I guess that would go all the way, even though when they're too old. They would mummify them, and then begin to mummify. At first, it was only the king can go. Pretty soon, everyone could go there. And they begin a mass production of mummification. The only problem was, for mummies, kings didn't want to be with all the riffraff. So when they removed the heart and put it in a jar next to it, supposedly, a lot of times they did take the heart and feed it to dogs. So the lower class wouldn't go to have it, the afterlife. Only the king would. And soon there's going to be thousands of mummies. Mummies everywhere. In Britain, it became a big deal to get mummified cats. They mummified so many cats because cats were considered holy animals. Why were cats holy animals? Because they ate the mice that got into the grains. Yep. So, little let's finish tomorrow and we'll go from there. I said 2.3, 2.4 for tomorrow. I'm ready for that. I have a quiz. How many questions do you want in the quiz tomorrow? 50. 8 to 10.